The Andes Mountains stretch along the western edge of South America, forming one of the longest and highest mountain ranges on Earth. In central Argentina and Chile, the range rises sharply, with peaks exceeding 20,000 feet. Snow and exposed rock dominate the landscape. Vegetation thins quickly with altitude, and above a certain height, it disappears entirely. What remains is stone, ice, and wind. In October 1972, late spring had begun in the southern hemisphere, but winter still held the upper elevations. Snowfields remained deep. Temperatures at night dropped well below freezing. During the day, sunlight reflected off the snow with a harsh brightness, while the air stayed thin and dry. Weather systems moved unpredictably through the mountains. Clouds could gather quickly, reducing visibility to near zero. The region where Argentina meets Chile is among the most remote sections of the Andes. There are no permanent settlements at high altitude. Few roads cross the range, and those that do follow lower passes far from the highest peaks. Search aircraft flying above these mountains must contend with turbulence, limited oxygen, and narrow margins for error. In this environment, distance is difficult to judge. Valleys and ridgelines repeat themselves, creating a sense of sameness. Sound does not carry far. Movement is slow and exhausting. Survival depends on preparation, shelter, and the ability to manage exposure. It was into this landscape that a small turboprop aircraft entered on the morning of October 13, 1972, carrying passengers who expected the mountains to be only a view from their windows. The passengers aboard Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 were not seasoned travelers to remote regions. Most were young men in their late teens and early 20s. They were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, an amateur team from Montevideo, Uruguay. Rugby was a central part of their lives, but it existed alongside studies, family obligations, and ordinary routines. Several relatives and friends accompanied the team, filling the cabin with a mix of players, supporters, and a few unrelated passengers. The journey was planned months in advance. The team had been invited to play a friendly match in Santiago, Chile. Commercial flights were expensive, so arrangements were made with the Uruguayan Air Force to charter a Fairchild FH-227D turboprop aircraft. The plane was commonly used for short regional flights. It was not designed for extreme altitudes, but the planned route avoided the highest peaks by following established air corridors through the Andes. On October 12, 1972, the aircraft departed Montevideo and flew west toward Argentina. Poor weather over the mountains forced the pilots to land in Mendoza, where the passengers spent the night. The delay was frustrating but unremarkable. Weather interruptions were common on Andean routes, and no one viewed the situation as unusual. The following afternoon, conditions appeared to improve. The pilots decided to continue the flight. The aircraft carried 5 crew members and 40 passengers, totaling 45 people. Luggage and sports equipment filled the cargo hold. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was relaxed. Some passengers talked quietly. Others slept. A few looked out the windows as the terrain below shifted from plains to foothills. The pilots followed a flight plan that required navigating around mountain peaks rather than crossing directly over them. This demanded careful timing and precise position estimates. At the time, aircraft relied heavily on dead reckoning and radio beacons, especially in areas where radar coverage was limited. Cloud cover obscured visual landmarks, increasing dependence on calculations and assumptions. None of the passengers were aware of these details. To them, the flight was simply the final leg of a routine trip. They expected to arrive in Santiago by early evening. The mountains outside were part of the scenery, distant and silent, with no indication of how closely they would soon define the limits of survival. As Flight 571 progressed westward on October 13th, the aircraft encountered increasing cloud cover. The Andes below were no longer visible. The pilots relied on instruments and estimated their position based on speed, time, and wind conditions. This method assumed stable weather and predictable winds. In mountainous regions, those assumptions often fail. The flight plan required the aircraft to reach a specific radio beacon near the Chilean town of Curicó before beginning its descent toward Santiago. Believing they had already passed this point, The pilots requested and received clearance to descend. In reality, headwinds had slowed the aircraft more than anticipated. The plane was still deep within the Andes. As the descent began, the aircraft emerged briefly from the clouds. Mountain ridges appeared suddenly, much closer than expected. The pilots attempted to climb, increasing engine power, but the aircraft lacked sufficient performance at that altitude. Seconds later, the right wing struck a ridge. It tore away, followed almost immediately by the tail section. The fuselage continued forward, sliding down a steep slope before coming to rest in a snow-filled valley. The impact killed several passengers instantly. Others were thrown forward, suffering fractures and internal injuries. The remaining fuselage lay tilted in the snow, its open rear exposed to the wind. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of the wind moving across the mountains. The survivors took stock of their surroundings. Jagged peaks rose on all sides. There were no trees, no roads, no signs of human presence. The altitude exceeded 11,000 feet. The cold was immediate and unrelenting. The aircraft radio was damaged, and no working navigation equipment remained. As the day faded, the reality of their situation became clear. They were alive, but they were isolated in one of the most unforgiving environments on the continent. The mountains offered no clear path out. Rescue, if it came at all, would have to find them first. The survivors gathered what they could from the damaged fuselage before night fell. Temperatures dropped quickly after sunset, and the cold moved in without resistance. Snow surrounded the aircraft on all sides. The fuselage itself, broken and incomplete, became the only available shelter. Seats were removed and rearranged to block openings. Luggage was stacked to reduce wind exposure. Pieces of insulation were torn from the walls and pressed into gaps. Inside, space was limited. Injured passengers lay along the floor, wrapped in clothing and seat covers. Several people had broken legs, ribs, or collarbones. One crew member was critically injured and would not survive the night. Others died in the following days from trauma sustained during the crash. The survivors did what they could with no medical equipment beyond a small first aid kit. Food was scarce from the beginning. The aircraft carried no emergency rations suitable for extended survival. What remained were chocolate bars, a few bottles of wine, small jars of jam, and limited snacks brought by passengers. These were inventoried and rationed carefully. Each person received a few bites per day. Hunger became constant within a week. Snow provided water. It was melted using sunlight and small metal pieces warmed against the body. Dehydration was avoided, but the effort required to melt snow was slow and inefficient. At night, the cold made sleep shallow and fragmented. People slept sitting upright, pressed together for warmth. The altitude affected everyone. Breathing was difficult. Movement caused exhaustion. Simple tasks required frequent rest. Despite this, routines developed. Snow was cleared from the fuselage each morning to prevent collapse. Injuries were monitored. Watches were synchronized to track time, though days blurred together under cloud cover and glare. A small radio recovered from the wreckage became a focal point. For several days, survivors heard news reports describing the search for the missing aircraft. The hope of rescue remained strong. Then, on the 8th day, they heard an announcement stating that the search had been called off. The aircraft was presumed lost. The announcement changed the group's understanding of their situation. Rescue would not come without their own action. From that point, survival required adaptation beyond short-term endurance. The most difficult decision followed. With no vegetation or animals, there was no natural food source. After days of discussion and hesitation, the group concluded that survival required consuming the bodies of those who had died. The decision was not taken lightly. It was approached with restraint and necessity, framed as the only remaining option to preserve life. Portions were rationed carefully. There was no excess. Weeks passed. Snowstorms came and went. On the 17th day, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night, burying it completely. 8 people were killed. The survivors dug themselves out over several days, emerging into an even more constrained space, surrounded by deeper snow and fewer resources. Despite losses, routines continued. Tools were fashioned from metal scraps. Sunglasses were made from seat material to prevent snow blindness. Plans were discussed repeatedly. The mountains remained unchanged, vast and unmoving, while time stretched forward without markers. As the weeks passed, physical decline became difficult to ignore. Weight loss was visible in everyone. Muscles weakened. Simple movements caused dizziness. The cold aggravated old injuries that never fully healed. Infections spread slowly, untreated and persistent. Frostbite affected fingers and toes. The altitude continued to strain lungs and hearts already under stress. The deaths accumulated without ceremony. Some were the result of injuries sustained in the crash. Others came later from complications, exposure, or exhaustion. Each death reduced the group's capacity to function. Tasks that once required one person now needed two. Clearing snow became slower. Maintaining the fuselage required longer breaks and careful pacing. The avalanche had altered their sense of time. Days inside the buried fuselage passed in near darkness. When they emerged, the landscape looked the same but felt further away. Snowbanks were higher. Paths they had walked before were erased. Any previous sense of progress was gone. Psychological strain deepened. Silence became more common. Conversation shortened. The radio, now useless, was set aside. Some survivors marked days by habit rather than certainty. Others stopped counting altogether. The idea of rescue faded, replaced by the immediate need to survive another night. Several attempts were made to explore the surrounding terrain. These were limited by cold, altitude, and lack of equipment. One early expedition ended quickly when the group discovered that nearby ridges only led to higher, steeper peaks. The scale of the mountains became clearer with each attempt. What had seemed like a short climb revealed itself as an unbroken expanse of snow and rock. The announcement that the search had ended remained present in memory. It was not spoken often, but it shaped decisions. Survival was no longer about waiting. It was about deciding whether escape was possible at all. By late November, it became evident that remaining at the crash site indefinitely would lead to death. Food supplies, even with strict rationing, were diminishing. Strength was failing. The group faced a narrowing set of options. Staying meant slow decline. Leaving meant confronting the mountains with minimal equipment and uncertain direction. Loss had become routine, but it did not become easier. Each absence changed the group's structure. Responsibility shifted toward those still capable of movement. The margin for error disappeared. Survival now depended on a decision that could not be delayed much longer. By early December, the group accepted that remaining near the wreckage would not lead to survival. The surrounding environment offered no new resources, and physical strength continued to decline. Any chance of rescue depended on reaching inhabited areas beyond the mountains. After weeks of discussion, the survivors agreed that a small number would attempt to walk west toward Chile. Preparation took days. Materials were gathered from the wreckage. Pieces of insulation, seat fabric, and wire were used to construct a crude sleeping bag capable of retaining heat during the night. Food portions were set aside for the journey, measured carefully to support several days of travel. Direction was chosen based on limited observation and assumption. The group believed Chile lay beyond the western peaks. Roberto Canessa and Fernando Nando Paradu were selected to make the attempt. Both were physically stronger than most, and both had recovered from serious injuries earlier in the ordeal. They left the crash site with a third companion, who turned back after several days due to exhaustion. Paradu and Canessa continued alone. They climbed ridges that revealed higher ridges beyond them. Progress was slow. Snow concealed crevasses and unstable slopes. At night, they sheltered inside the improvised sleeping bag, conserving energy and minimizing exposure. Food was consumed sparingly. Each step required deliberate effort. After 10 days of travel, the terrain began to change. Snow thinned. Rock became visible. Signs of lower elevation appeared. On December 20th, they encountered a man on horseback, Sergio Catalan, on the Chilean side of the mountains. Communication was limited by distance and noise from the river between them. A written note was thrown across the water, explaining the situation. Catalan alerted authorities. Rescue efforts began immediately. Paradu and Canessa remained where they were, conserving strength. The journey had confirmed what had seemed uncertain for weeks. Survival beyond the mountains was possible. Rescue helicopters reached the crash site on December 22, 1972. Weather conditions limited how many people could be evacuated at once. Over 2 days, the remaining survivors were lifted out of the mountains and flown to safety. 16 people survived the 72 days in the Andes. The wreckage was left behind, partially buried in snow where it would remain for years. In the weeks that followed, public attention focused on the details of survival. Questions arose about the decisions made in isolation. The survivors spoke cautiously and factually. They described necessity rather than heroism. Religious, ethical, and medical discussions followed, many of them unresolved. Over time, the event became part of historical record rather than ongoing debate. Investigations confirmed the cause of the crash as navigational error compounded by weather and terrain. No mechanical failure was found. Aviation procedures were reviewed. The incident became a reference point in discussions of flight safety in mountainous regions. For the survivors, recovery extended beyond physical healing. Some returned to public life. Others remained private. The mountains did not disappear from memory, but they receded into context. What remained was a record of endurance under conditions that allowed little margin for interpretation or comfort. The Andes continued unchanged. Snow accumulated and melted with each season. The location of the crash faded from view, but the event did not. It remained a documented account of human survival within strict limits, defined not by triumph but by persistence.